I see Taiwan as not being very different from the Philippines. In that sense, there's still that traditional mindset where I invest only if I know someone else who already jumped in and made the investment. In terms of my wish list, I actually think that it would benefit Taiwan to have programs that are more catered towards the early stage.
Taiwanese can see this as a great opportunity, because opportunity to work with people, not just Taiwanese, but also different. It's a good way to train yourself to embrace different kind of culture.
Check the mic and make sure it sound right, boys.
What's up, what's down, what's going on around? This is Startup Taiwan Foreigner's Business Guide. I'm Paulo Leasing, founder at MillionDC.com. This YouTube channel and podcast are offshoot of my book, Startup Taiwan Foreigner's Business Guide, published in Q4 last year. This channel will find answers to your questions about how to start a business in Taiwan. So leave those questions in the comment section below. Enough about me, let me introduce our guest. Earl Panganiban is from the Philippines. He is CEO and founder at Beyond Autonomy, an early-stage startup registered in Delaware and headquartered in Taipei. His team at Beyond Autonomy is working on an affordable, non-LiDAR way to create high-definition maps for autonomous vehicles, advanced driver assistance systems, and smart cities. Their mission is to make our roads safe. Earl is TensorFlow certified developer and a Google Cloud certified professional data engineer. He finished his MBA from the Holt International Business School and his Bachelor of Science in Applied Physics from the University of the Philippines. What a better way to start our show than having a Filipino as my first guest. Earl, welcome to the show. Kumusta?
I'm feeling great. Thanks for having me, Paulo.
First question, and this will always be the first question. What is your Taiwan connection? How did you get into Taiwan?
Well, I'm connected to Taiwan because my wife is from Taiwan. I knew little about the island up until I finally got to meet her, and that's when I had more chances to actually visit and look around. In terms of how I got here, well, it started with me grabbing that COVID test at least 3 days before my flight, and I hopped on a plane, and then I'm here.
And the way I understand it is that you're here because your wife actually encouraged you to move to Taiwan amid the pandemic, right?
Actually, it's my in-laws. So my wife and I have been living in Manila for the past 3 years. And then COVID happened, and her parents sort of felt a lot safer to have her back in the island, which is why we pretty much dropped everything that we had in Manila and got on a plane, and now we're here.
All right. So earlier we did like an introduction of your company, but I want to hear it from you. What is your startup all about?
All right. So Beyond Autonomy is an early stage startup that's working on building a platform to facilitate collective knowledge for smart mobility. What does that mean? Well, when we started this company, we were thinking that there were already a lot of autonomous vehicle startups out there. It's just that a lot of them were working on one basic thing, which is to replace the human driver in a car. However, we believe that computers can do way much more than just replacing the human driver. And in fact, you can even get them to do cool things the moment they're connected to one another, similar to how we did it with the internet. For Beyond Autonomy, we are actually working to get more of these eyes on the road and having the cars share that information with one another. That way, it would allow them to make driving decisions even for objects or events on the road that they cannot see.
But for ordinary citizen, if you could explain it in like a super layman's term, how is your technology going to benefit the common users?
All right. So with that said, I can actually share a story from what happened when I was walking to the co-working space this morning. I almost got hit by a bicycle. And that's just walking along the sidewalks because Taipei in general has a lot of blind spots. and a lot of small alleys. And the thing about these sidewalks is that even if you're walking around and just minding your own business, you don't really know if there's a bicycle or a motorcycle or even a car that's heading towards that intersection where you're currently walking. And that's it. We believe that if we have more eyes on the road, we can actually make this kind of information available such that you would know even before you reach that intersection, if you're driving, that there's a pedestrian that's trying to beat the red light. Or if, for example, if you're driving your car and then there's a huge truck in front of you, then you would have good information on whether it's safe to actually pass that truck or not. Because even if you can't see the car in the opposite lane, or if there's actually a car in front of the truck, having all of that information available in a common map would allow you to make much better and much safer driving decisions.
All right, I think I understood it much better. So talk about the composition of your company. So your startup is composed of a co-founder who is a Taiwanese, and both of you are now living in Taiwan, while another co-founder is based in the States. The question is, how did you find your Taiwanese co-founder?
All right. So I actually met Sunny at one of the Anchor events back in December. Meet the Anchors is actually an event from Anchor Taiwan, which is conducted by Elisa Cho. And what they pretty much do is they have these monthly sessions where they invite entrepreneurs, both foreign and local, to actually come together in a room and talk to each other and look for opportunities to actually work with one another. I met Sunny at that event, and I was particularly interested in her profile because she was creating iOS apps while trying to interface with embedded or the smaller devices, smaller electronic devices. And she did mention that she worked on Bluetooth Low Energy, which is actually one of the interesting fields in embedded programming as of now. And that's when I got curious to find out what kind of platform is she working with, because for our project we've been using both the Jetson Nano from NVIDIA and Raspberry Pi. Unfortunately, she didn't come from those two platforms. They were working on their own custom solution. But still, it's pretty much the same process where you kind of get computers and phones and devices to talk to one another. And from there, I kind of thought that I could actually pick her brain out and maybe even grab her to become part of the team.
Yeah, actually, earlier we had like an interview with her, and she pretty much talked about how initially she wasn't really sure whether you're trying to get her into the team, but she just you wanted to just get to know her, like her profile and what basically introduce the company. And then upon studying further, she was also impressed with what you know about the technology that you guys are working on. And so this is why she joined in. Let me throw the same question that I asked her earlier. What do you think is the necessary factors so that more foreigners will have Taiwanese as a co-founder in any startup here in Taiwan?
I think in terms of working with Taiwanese and being a foreigner, I think there's nothing really specific to just the Taiwanese. It can actually apply regardless of who you're working with, whether it's from person from the US or person from Latin America, person from Korea, Japan. I feel like as long as you guys have an open mind and you're willing to, you already reached that that thought where everybody's different, but despite that, we all have things in common. There are things that that are similar among all of us. Then we can actually work together. Simply because once we've already accepted that, then we can start to focus more on the things we have in common or the purpose we have in mind, as opposed to being different and how this person may have an attitude that's not necessarily something you're used to.
Okay, and your other co-founder is from the US. Any plans to bring him to Taiwan so that the three of you could actually work on this startup?
Yes, so Steven's actually based off of Denver at the moment. I know you didn't ask the question, but I would also like to introduce Steven for a little bit. So I actually met Steven at my MBA back in 2015. And he was one of the guys that I really enjoyed working with, and we were part of this group called the Nerd Herd. And we actually won a corporate innovation challenge back then. So Steven is also one of those rare people in the MBA program who actually know how to code or had that technical experience, which is why it's a lot easier to actually talk to him and relate, simply because we are coming from the same IT background.
You went to the Holt International.
Yes,
Okay.
So I went to Holt International Business School in Shanghai. Initially, I was planning to rotate to the San Francisco campus because that's where Silicon Valley is. But then I managed to get an internship for a local boutique angel fund in Shanghai. It's called Angel Vest. And that's where I got to meet a lot of interesting people, angel investors and venture capital. And also got exposed to the startup ecosystem in Shanghai, which is pretty much why I got interested into getting into startups in the first place.
Oh, let me pull it back to the question. Do you have any plans to bring Steven to Taiwan?
Yes, we have plans to bring Steven to Taiwan, simply because Steven is currently working on the hardware aspect of our solution. Taiwan is definitely one of those places that come to mind when you think about hardware, because pretty much all of the good stuff are built or are made here in Taiwan.
I guess for our viewers who are mostly foreigners, the question is for anyone who is planning to start their business in Taiwan, the question is, why Taiwan?
Why Taiwan? Well, it's not as crowded as the more advanced locations in terms of startup support, for example, Singapore, Hong Kong, Silicon Valley. So Taiwan is actually a place where you can have that intimate group. The startup ecosystem here is a lot smaller and everybody knows everybody. So it's also a lot easier to get the kind of support that you need, because there's a really good chance that the person you need is actually just one or two connections away from you. In terms of the ecosystem itself, you can also see that it's in a period of growth. There's a lot of ecosystem builders who are actually working to make it more inclusive and to make the system work for both local and foreign entrepreneurs.
When you talk about easy access to talents, are you referring both to foreigners or both foreigners and Taiwanese, or just foreigners or just Taiwanese?
Like I mentioned earlier, it has completely nothing to do with the race or the origin. I can see that Taiwan is actually growing to become one of those hubs for artificial intelligence and hardware development and cloud computing as well. So Google is setting up shop here. I remember Amazon opened a new office, and I think Microsoft is doing the same thing, which means there's definitely a lot of potential here, and there's a lot of good talent in Taiwan that you can leverage if you are planning on setting up your own startup.
What's the main difference compared to back in our home, the Philippines?
What's the biggest difference? Well, I think the startup ecosystem in the Philippines is much smaller. I know a lot of folks who have been running their own startups and even decided to incorporate outside. The folks I know incorporated either in Hong Kong or in Singapore, simply because the legislation and the kind of support you would expect for an early stage startup is just not readily available in the Philippines. And what I mean by that is that even in terms of the innovation and the startups, you can only go so far unless you partner with a name that's already big, like the Ayalas or the BDOs or the SMs. If you're a small startup, then unless you're already connected with that small angel group in the Philippines, then there's a big chance that you're probably going to be running out of resources or money before you can even get that level of support. Well, we do have some startups that have been successful. I mean, I've heard of this startup who managed to raise a funding round with Y Combinator recently. But in the Philippines, those cases are rare, whereas in Taiwan, you can actually have more startups who are working in the early stage and getting the kind of support that they need from the government.
Okay. So as a Filipino, what do you think, and coming to Taiwan, what is the main, or what are the misconceptions about a Filipino that you hear here in Taiwan?
The thing about Filipinos in Taiwan, at least from what I've heard or from what I've experienced, is that generally they ask me again if I'm really Filipino, because people probably had the misconception that Filipinos are generally dark or are short. And then when they see me and like, you don't really look, or you don't really fit that sort of stereotype.
The profile, right?
That profile. And I'm like, well, Filipinos are also diverse. We don't all look the same. So it's probably the fact that more of those stereotypes are what they readily see here in Taiwan. But the Philippines has a lot more to offer than just what came to.
And the reason why I brought you to this show as my first guest is actually to tell everyone that Filipinos can also do different works, like works that are not just help in the household or help in the medical industry. And this is why I wanted to like be proud and have you as our main guest to show the world that, hey, Filipinos can do much more than what they box us into as probably nurses, which is a really good job, by the way, or household help, which is another economy helping job that Filipinos have been doing for the last like 1 or 2 decades. But I also, this is why I brought you here, is to highlight what you guys are, what we are up to here in Taiwan. So, okay, so the next question is, okay, so your wife is Taiwanese, so how is your Chinese?
It's not that good. What did she teach me again? 我可以说一点点中文，比较多说英文。I'm not sure if I even said that correctly.
I think you said it perfectly. And I'm guessing that your Chinese is just as good as mine, even though I've been here for like 11 years. Do you think learning the language is important?
Yes, it's very important. I would have to say this about Taiwan, at least compared to the other Mandarin-speaking countries that I've been to, namely Hong Kong or Singapore. I think, and even Shanghai, practically. In Shanghai, you can actually get around and not have a single hint of Mandarin and live there for like decades. But I think in terms of Taiwan, you really get the advantage if you can speak even just a little bit of the language. I mean, you can order the food that you want. You can actually make more friends and be part of the community here if you can speak Mandarin. And that's why I've been learning Mandarin, and the government has good support for the spouse of Taiwanese. And they even provide free books and free classes, which is why I'm really trying to take advantage of that.
I suppose you could also say the same thing for running startups that are composed of a foreigner and a Taiwanese. Is Mandarin necessary?
Yes, especially if you're trying to network around. I mean, when I first came to Taiwan, I was actually looking for events where I can meet people and that it would be conducted in English so that I can at least get a feel of what's going on. And I've been struggling. I mean, the first few months that I've been looking for events like that, and even groups like your group and Andrew's group and the other ecosystem builders here, it actually took me a while to sort of map out Taiwan and actually find where you guys are hanging out. Before I got in touch with the foreign group who was working on entrepreneurship and startups here, it was actually quite a struggle to walk around and meet people under the expectation that you would have to communicate or converse in Mandarin. but I'm getting around that now. I mean, I've been getting friends. Plus, the fact that I have a Taiwanese co-founder with me, Sunny, who is also helping out and attend those events that are conducted only in Mandarin and reach out to people who are not very comfortable speaking English.
You also speak Japanese, so why not Japan?
I learned Japanese back at the university. I was actually part of a program that was co-sponsored by JICA, from the Japanese government. I did learn Japanese, but it's not really to the level where you can actually function at work. So as far as my Japanese is concerned, I'm trying to say it in Japanese, but watashi no nihongo wa warui desu. It's still bad. Mada warui desu. It's still bad.
All right, let's talk about your wish list. Without putting you in trouble, what do you think could the Taiwan government or the Taiwan startup ecosystem improve on in order to foster growth of startups in Taiwan?
Yeah. Well, in terms of that perspective, I think I see Taiwan as not being very different from the Philippines. In that sense, there's still that traditional mindset where I invest only if I know someone else who already jumped in and made the investment. So there's that sort of risk aversion when it comes to investing in startups that are still new or fairly early stage, and that people are looking for that kind of traction. Where in the industry we are in, it's sort of quite difficult, because if you're working on a transportation startup, even as you're building your first pilot or your first prototype, you are already spending some money because there's a hardware component to it. As opposed to if you're just building an app, then you can actually get started with very little to no cost. So in terms of my wish list, I actually think that it would benefit Taiwan to have programs that are more catered towards the early stage. And what I mean by that is even for founders who are still at the ideation stage and who are still contemplating about setting up shop here in Taiwan, simply because that's actually the point in the startup's life where you kind of need more help and where you can avoid costly mistakes. I mean, the moment you get you receive the mentoring about the way to think about startups, is entrepreneurship even right for the founder? What's the right way to think about it? I mean, even those programs, you don't really need to spend a lot of money because you're not buying equipment or you're not building platforms on the cloud yet. But actually getting the founder to think the right way about how to get started, which things to spend on, which things not to spend on, what to focus on, how to find founders. Is it now the right time to actually incorporate? Is now the right time to talk to venture capital? I mean, even those kinds of practical things can actually be a big help already. And I think your platform is actually doing a good job trying to eventually get to that level.
Thank you. What I was trying to really focus on in terms of Million DC and the book Startup Taiwan is really help people ease the burden of the simple things that they can actually, do.
Mm-hmm.
And this is the reason why we have this channel, just to continue offer the viewers some tips and some insights on how to go around the system when they want to start their business in Taiwan. I guess another question for you is, do you have any tips for any Filipino founders who want to start their business here? You're basically talking to the Filipinos who are in the Philippines, for example.
Well, I think one of the first things you need to have in mind is to think about that entry point into Taiwan. In my case, it was a fairly easier transition in the sense that my wife is from Taiwan, and I pretty much enjoyed the same status in terms of looking for work or in terms of setting up a company as any other Taiwanese would. And that's actually rare. Unless you're already married to a Taiwanese. I mean, because it's not all the time Taiwanese visit the Philippines, for example, or you get to fly to Taiwan actually looking for a spouse. But I'm sure there are many different ways you can actually get into Taiwan. For example, there's also the Gold Card program, where if you have the particular skill set that Taiwan needs, if you're working in advanced technologies related to AI or advanced manufacturing, hardware, I think they're actually looking for talent in that area. So that's actually one of the entry points as well. And then, of course, you can also probably follow a similar route as yours, where you actually got to study here and get to meet the people around here and see if Taiwan is really the right place for you. In terms of other tips, I think it would also help you with your journey to have a Taiwanese co-founder on board. And I know that it's not a very easy thing to do. I actually feel lucky that Sunny decided to come on board. But it would definitely help with a lot of things, especially if you're trying to get support from the government, or if you're trying to get your company registered here in Taiwan, or even as simple as opening a bank account for the company. I think it would be a fairly easier process if the Taiwanese co-founder is the one working on it, as opposed to if the founder, if the foreigner founder is actually the one taking those steps. And yeah, I mean, if there's one final piece of advice, it's to also look into what Taiwan can do for your startup. There's a lot of different places where you can actually get started, and a lot of good programs from other governments as well. So for example, in Fukuoka, Japan, they have a really good program for startups there. Korea is also trying to compete in that space. I think they recently have an Incheon hub. Then there's the more traditional places like Singapore, Hong Kong. And then there's the European countries as well, which are very innovative. Like if you go to Berlin or in Amsterdam or in London, then there's the US, and there's a bunch of other locations. I mean, I can go on and on, but there are some unique aspects about Taiwan that really appealed to my startup in general, and simply because there's a hardware piece into what I'm building, then of course it would be a bigger benefit for me to be a lot closer to where that hardware is actually coming from.
Okay, so we're now into the next section of our interview, which is called Fast Round. So I got this from another interview that I had from Radio Taiwan International, or Radio Taiwan. The reporter Valentine from France did like a fast round of questions. So,
are there any rules to this game?
Just tell me the first
thing that comes to my mind.
To your mind.
No word limit.
Yeah, sure. No word limit. No word limit. All right. So, what's your daily breakfast?
Just coffee.
What show are you currently watching on Netflix?
Sisyphus, I think was the name. It's a Korean show about quantum mechanics and time travel.
Okay, so nerdy. Are you a morning or night person?
Definitely morning.
Are you Android or iOS user?
If I get to choose, I would actually pick none of them, but since I'm using a phone right now, it's Android.
Could you qualify why you wouldn't use those two?
Because if there's a way for me to live without having to give off my data, then I would do that.
All right, Mac or PC?
Depends.
You're a difficult person. Okay.
Yes, I'm a difficult person. Mac for development, Linux for other stuff, PC for games.
All right. Favorite game? If you played games.
Favorite game right now, I'm playing Total War: The Three Kingdoms.
Favorite movie of all time?
Favorite movie of all time? Definitely Back to the Future Part 2.
Favorite book?
Journey to the Center of the Earth, Jules Verne.
All right. So yeah, let's wrap this up with action item. What is it that you need to work on in the next couple of months, and what kind of help are you looking for? So you may address our audience or the government or whoever you need help with.
All right. So in terms of what needs to be done for my project, we sort of hit this chicken and egg problem where people would want to talk to us once we have something to show. And we couldn't, it's difficult to come up with a basic specification of what you can show if you don't have the input from your users, right? So in terms of the development from our end, we've been focused intently on building a prototype that would at least prove the high-level concept and the solution that we are trying to achieve. And once we do get around that, then hopefully people would understand it more in terms of what this technology can offer, how it can help with their current solution, and what we can do to actually build on top of this so that we can increase the value for everybody. In terms of help at this point, well, we are keen on talking to people who are working in the fleet management or transportation space. We are also keen on working with people from the government simply because they already have the right infrastructure in place. I mean, Taiwan already has a lot of cameras that are recording information about the roads. And if we can sort of leverage that so that we can have these events and these objects on the road plotted out in a common map for everybody to sort of use. Then that will definitely speed up the process of actually scaling that project and making it at least useful for everybody who would be driving around and using these maps.
Are you talking about the cameras that are the security cameras that are mounted on the streets as something that could be part of what you're working on?
Yes. So the thing about my startup is that we are trying to collect information about the road, right? But there's already a lot of devices that are collecting information about the road. For example, most cars right now have dash cameras, and people just tend to throw away that data anyway. I mean, after it fills your SD card, you simply delete your old data and then overwrite it with new ones. At the same time, I think the government already has the infrastructure for the traffic cameras in place, and they're using it more for traffic management, sort of deciding the algorithms around how traffic lights work and which roads to widen and those sort of things. So it means that there's already enough devices that are collecting data about the road. It's now high time to put them all together in one map that would actually help us solve this particular safety use case when it comes to blind spots in general. So if we can reach out to the people who are working in this space or working in this field, then I think we can look for opportunities and explore them together to see if we can actually work with each other and arrive at that win-win, not only for the parties involved but also for the community as a whole.
I guess the action item for us as well is, at least for my side, is to research further on this clause in the government laws about freedom of information access, whether we could access information that are being fed by the cameras, the security cameras. And from that, I guess it'll be very helpful for your startup. And yeah, and with that, I would like to thank you for being our first guest in our show. Thank you, Earl. Maraming salamat. Until next time.
Thanks for having me, Paulo, and really appreciate it.
Check the mic and make sure it sound right, boys.